This is going to be a really quick introduction to using Compass and how you can use it to produce sprites for your web projects. Sprites are an incredibly important part of the modern web. It really improves the user experience and it reduces bandwidth and bandwidth costs for your company, so it's something that you definitely want to look at. This is the default YouTube page where I live. I live in Japan, so all of the elements here coming from the YouTube site in Japan. And this is the sprite, or one of the sprites, that YouTube uses in their web page over here. And this is a pretty good example of a very complicated sprite. In the old days, each one of these elements would have been downloaded individually. So for example, this tiny little square here would have been a separate request. And as you can see, as a page gets more and more complicated and larger, and as you have events and mouse overs and different sizes and whatnot, the sprite, the images and the number of images that you have to have on your site gets just larger and larger and larger. And that means more and more requests, and those requests take time to resolve and return. And so if you can reduce it to a single request like this, you're going to be doing two things. You're going to be reducing the amount of time that it takes for a page to render for the end user, which makes the page look much better and faster for the end user. Nobody likes coming to a slow website. And the second thing that it does is it's going to reduce the bandwidth strain on your own architecture, which means that you may be able to put off having to scale up things for a long time, and hopefully also bring down your bandwidth costs. So it's something that's good for a company, and it's also something that's amazing for an end user, because nobody likes waiting for pages to load. Compass is one of the best tools right now for building out sprites. They've really simplified the process, and I'm going to go into a really simple example of how you can use Compass to build out your sprites. In order to get going with sprites, you're going to need to install it, but in order to install Compass, you're going to need to install Ruby as well. The only thing that I'm going to say about this is that if you're running on Windows, going through the default installation process is going to take a little longer, and there have been a couple of times when I've just been stymied and I've not been able to finish a Ruby installation. There are a couple of possible solutions to that. Number one is running RVM, which is a version manager for Ruby. Adds a level of complexity that most people may not be comfortable with. And the second option is to go with Ruby Installer, which I would highly recommend that you at least start with. And what it is a Windows-only pre-packaged installer for Ruby. And if you use this, you'll be ready to get going installing the rest of Compass in about 2 minutes. It's quite good. Once you've got Ruby installed, you can go through the process of installing Gem. Gem is the package manager for Ruby, and then it's really simple to get going with Compass. At the end of the process, you should be able to just type in Compass, and instead of getting a syntax error or some error from your console, you'll get instructions on how to use it. Now, you may not be used to doing stuff in console. There are GUIs for, I believe that there are GUIs for Compass. The chances are you actually don't need to use them. You're only going to use about 4 commands, and they're really easy to use, really easy to remember. The commands that we're going to be using are init to add Compass to an existing project. So we've got a project that we're going to add it to. Clean is if you want to clean out any of the temporary files and the compiled files, the stuff that Compass produces. You can use Compass clean to clean everything out. Compile will take the files that you write and turn them into valid CSS, and will generate the sprites that you need. And watch, and I'll go into watch in a second. This is our starting point. This is a really simple HTML page that I've written up. At this point it doesn't have style sheets, it doesn't have images, it doesn't have anything. It's nothing but an HTML page. And if we go here, you can see here's our page again. So nothing special. What we're going to do first is we're going to install we're going to add Compass to this project. Then we're going to add some images that we want to turn into a sprite, and then we're going to create the sprite. So let's get going. So right now we are in the same folder as our editor. I'm just in a demo project, and what we're going to do is we're going to add to this. There's the index.html. We're going to add to the same folder compass, and we're going to issue a command. The command is just compass init. What it's going to do is, in addition to all the congratulatory stuff, is that it will create a couple of directories, Sass and style sheets. It will create a config file, and it will populate the two directories that it created with some defaults that you can use or you don't have to use if you don't want to. I'm just going to go back to the IDE, and you can see they pop into existence here. I'm going to go into the config file in a second, but first I'm just going to talk about style sheets and Sass. Your browser is going to link to one of these files. Chances are IE is going to be. You can delete all of these. You can delete all of these files and start with your own. None of these are particularly magic, but just as a starting point, you're probably going to do all of your stuff for Screen. Screen is the style sheet that's going to be used by your browser. Now, you're not going to edit this. This is what Compass produces, and in this case, it's producing. You can see that everything is kind of spaced out. There's lots of white space to make it very readable, and there's lots of documentation. By default, this is the way that Compass will spit stuff out, and you're going to be able to change the config settings later to minify this and make it a lot smaller for production. But this is what you're going to link to in your HTML. So we're actually going to begin first by adding this that has been created. It's in Style Sheets. Screen. Let's just make sure that it's loading. And it is. And there's our file. Okay. So now we're loading the CSS. Now this is actually the last time that we're going to touch any of these files. This is the last time that we're gonna need these. I'm going to come back every once in a while to look at this, but we're going to be doing. These are the files that you're going to be editing. Sass is the name of the CSS framework that Compass uses. Compass is built on top of Sass, and Sass is simply a really nice framework for building out quite complicated. It's a way of simplifying your CSS so that it's much easier to work with, and it allows you to, for example, instead of if you have a color code that you use over and over and over and over, rather than having to hunt through your CSS to change it, if you need to make a change to a base color, you can assign it to a variable. It allows nesting of styles, so that it's a lot easier to isolate your styles and so on. So Sass is the language that you're going to write in, and so all the changes that you make are going to be in the Sass folder in your Sass CSS files, your SCSS files. You'll notice right away, if we just take a look again, so our screen SCSS file, there is a corresponding screen.css file. Every time that you add a file to Sass, to the Sass folder, and compile, it'll get recreated down here. So there will be, every time that you run it, there will be a corresponding set of files here. And in fact, you can delete this folder, and it will get recreated the next time that you run. So just to prove what's going on, I'm going to add a style. So I just added a color declaration, and just to prove that it's not just copying my stuff, it's interpreting it. I'm just going to put everything into one line, and this is in the Sass folder. Now I'm just going to come back here. And it will recreate it. And if we go down to our screen, at the very end, that's what I've just added. Okay, so you're going to be editing. You're going to be editing only the Sass files, and it will be producing. It will be outputting the CSS files for you. So that's the basis there. let's just take a real quick look at the config file. The config file, this is Ruby, but you don't have to know Ruby. It's pretty basic. You know exactly what this is doing, but I'll just go over some of the settings here. Your project is going to have a root path. So in this case, I'm running it in the root of the HTTP server that I'm running. But you may have a mini site called test or whatever. If that's your project, and that's where your CSS is going to live, then you have to modify this to reflect that. The rest of these basically tell Compass where to find things or where to put things. Your CSS directory is where it's going to write your style sheets. So the style sheets corresponds to the style sheets folder. Your Sass directory corresponds to where you are going to put the Sass files and where it's going to find your Sass files. Images is where it's going to look for your images. So if you have sprites, and we will have sprites in a moment, it's going to look for them in folders inside the images folder. And some mix-ins in Compass, some of the things that are going to be produced by Compass will also produce JavaScript, and you can specify that you want your scripts to be put in a special folder. In this case, JavaScripts, but you may want to call it scripts or JS or whatever. And the last thing that I'm going to just say is that during development, this is kind of handy because it will tell you the debug information really helps you. If I wanted to find out what produced this specific style, it'll tell me what file it was in and what line it was on where these were declared. That's great for development, but it's really horrible for production. And so what you're going to want to do when you're done and ready to produce everything for production is change the output style to compressed. And unless you're familiar with Ruby, I'm not very familiar with Ruby, I'm not a Ruby programmer, that is valid. This is a symbol in Ruby, and when you compile now, the CSS will be minified. And so this is the same one that we were looking at earlier. Let's change that back. Just take it out. Just go back to default. And it comes back in with all the documentation. So that's what the config file does. Okay, now I've already shown you the two of the commands that you're going to need to learn. We've used compass init to create and compass compile to create the files that we want. Every time that you make a change, in fact, I'm going to make a change right now. I'm going to take this out. And I'm going to take out their reset code. I'd recommend that you leave their reset code, or at least use your own reset code, but I'm going to take this out just for clarity. You'll notice that when I go to the CSS file, it hasn't changed. And the reason it hasn't changed is because you need to compile, which you've taken out the reset code, so it's gone from the CSS. Every time that you make a change, you have to compile. That's an added step that's kind of a headache. So they've also produced a convenience method called watch. And all it does is it just sits there and watches for changes to your file system. So if you make a change, it will watch for those changes and it will overwrite them. And now it'll show up there. So it's almost as easy now to be working on raw CSS files on your server, except now you're working on the SCSS file, the Sass files. The last command I'm just going to show you is compass clean. Compass clean will simply get rid of temporary files that it uses, so that this is going to be useful sometimes, especially when you're producing sprites. The watch process doesn't quite work the way that it should, and it won't produce the files that you need. And what I sometimes need to do is I need to stop the watch process, do a clean, and then either do a compile or just start watching again. So I've done a clean, and then it recreates everything for you. So those are the basic functions that you need. You've got compass init to create your project, compass compile to compile your project, compass clean to clean everything out and to get things into a nice clean slate. Pardon me. And compass watch to simplify your build process. Now let's talk about sprites. We're going to add another folder to our project. Actually, I'm going to do it here. So here's our project here. And what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to bring in all of these little images. What I've done is I've got like just imagine that I'm building a website that looks like this. This is just a PSD file. Everything's been laid out, and when I'm ready to start developing, what I would do is remove the background gradient so that everything's on top of transparent, or at least on white, or something that is appropriate in that setting, and then slice everything out, put slices around all the elements that I want to keep, so every single navigation item will have its own slice for side nav, top nav, and so on. And then export everything. I did have to do a little bit of renaming of the file names, but then spit out the individual items that I need. So there's the arrow, there's the logo. Here's a side nav with a on state and an off state, and down here we've got top nav as well. Top nav in an off state, top nav in an on state. So here are our elements. In the old days, the way that I would have built this would have been to load these individually, and I would have used JavaScript to switch back and forth between on state and off state. The modern way of doing this would be to use hover in CSS, and so that's what we're actually going to do here. But first we need to get these files into our project. Our Ruby file expects images to be found in an images folder. And I'm going to put all of the sprites into a folder. Until you get comfortable with Compass, don't call this folder Sprites. If you call it Sprites, it's going to be a little bit confusing later, because Sprites is sort of a special keyword for Compass, and so you're going to have sprites and sprites in two places, and it's going to be really confusing. Call it something else. Let's call it icons. And we're going to paste them in. So we've got 34 images that are in an icons folder. Okay, so our images folder has a folder called icons, and the sprite is going to be based on icons. And so let's start. I'm going to keep the CSS file open, but just remember, don't make changes to your CSS. Only work on your Sass. The first thing that you do is import. And you're going to import from images. You don't need to say images because that's already been specified in your config. So what the folder is going to be inside images, and in this case it's going to be called icons. And we're going to grab all the PNGs. .png. You can't use JPEGs and you can't use GIFs for sprites because of the image library that they're using. I think they may be bringing it in the future, but just stick to PNGs. They compress better. The output is going to be better, and the output is going to be better. So we've imported our icons. I'm going to shut down watch, and I'm going to compile manually. Okay, so I've saved this. And now I'm going to compile. Compiling is going to take a while. It goes through the IE and print. These ones haven't changed. These files haven't changed. But it's going through all of the images. It's pulling up the bitmaps. It's putting them into a new image, and then compressing everything and optimizing everything. So that process takes a while, and it especially takes a while here because I'm also recording the screen captures. So forgive it taking extra long on this computer. So at the end of the process, it has done two things. It has created a new image, and the image has a unique name. Anytime that you change one of your sprite images, one of the source images, and recompile, it's going to produce a unique name. And then the second thing that it's done is it's modified the CSS file. We go here, and it's now linking to it. So that's step one in getting the sprites done. At least it's produced the image and it's added the image in a way that it can be used in CSS. This is not enough. We also have to say where each one of the individual images are in that, and you have to say how big they are, how wide and how tall they are. But the first step is definitely producing the image. And there's the image that it produced. It's a little bit of a hodgepodge, doesn't look particularly good. If you were going to do this by hand, you'd probably organize it a little bit differently. But it doesn't matter because this is all going to be managed by Compass. So it doesn't matter whether it's messy, it's going to take care of putting it all together in the right form. Okay, so we're part of the way there. Now the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to include all sprites. There's a little bit of a magic naming convention in Compass, and you're going to see this every once in a while. The reason earlier I said don't call your folder sprites, and this is why. This is going to correspond to the folder that you put your sprites into. You could have multiple, you could have import. Navigation icons. You could bring in another folder, and so on. And the name that you use for your folder is going to get put in here. So there's a little bit of a magic naming convention that goes on in Compass, but it's kind of useful and kind of easy once you get used to it. So icons, we're going to bring in all the icon sprites. And I'm going to compile again. In fact, why don't I turn on, at this point I'll turn on watch. Okay, so it overwrote screen.css. Now if you remember before, all that screen.css had in it was one rule. It said where the image was. But now it's added all of the individual items. We're definitely not finished at this point. All we have is the origin of each one of the sprites in that large sprite image. What we need next are the height and width, but we're almost there. So now we're going to add the dimensions, the height and width, and the way to do that is using, again, it's more sort of magic naming conventions, and there's sort of a lack of consistency in the way that they did things, so it's kind of annoying. You have to keep checking the documentation to see the way that you're supposed to do it, but that's okay. Sprite, not sprites, but sprite dimensions. True. So again, in this case, our sprite folder is icons. And I'm just going to clear that so that when I save this, so now it's overwritten, you can see it's overwritten screen.css. And when we go to screen.css, now everything's done. This is actually ready. We're done with sprites. The sprites are ready to be used here. And in fact, why don't I just show you? So it's created a new class, and the class is going to be the folder icons and then the name of the image. So I've got a logo image, logo, and this corresponds to that image. So if I create a div that has a class of icons logo, what we should end up with is something that looks just like that. So let's do that. I'm going to create a div with a class of icons logo. That's all we've done. And when we reload our page, there it's done. So literally all we had to do at this point was include the class name. And that's that's how sprites work, but in this case, it's an incredible amount of work that's been reduced to 3 lines of code. So that's one way that you can include your sprites. You can include all of them, and it will simply build out the class names that you need. There's a second way to do it. There's no reason that you can't keep this in, but I'm just going to remove this for now. And I'm going to create a new div. I'm just going to call it test. And I'm going to create a test class. Now remember, before we include icons sprite, all sprites, sorry, all icon sprites. Right, so we included all of them. The syntax here is going to be a little bit different, but we're still going to include icons, name of the folder, sprite, single, and it's a function. And now we're going to give it just the name. So it already knows that it's in the icons folder, so we're going to give it the image name, logo. Let me get rid of this and make sure that it doesn't produce an error, and it hasn't. Now when we go to our CSS, it's just produced that. So we still have this giant sprite image, but we've only produced the class that we need for that one image. And if we go back here, it should be basically the same, and it is. And if we were to change that to, let's change that to arrow. I think it was called arrow. It wasn't called arrow. HR_arrow. There we are. It's produced that. Look at the CSS. So again, you can do both, and there's no reason that you can't do both. All icon sprites. There, sorry, it just took a little while to build. So there's no reason that you can't do all of those. It will produce both, all of these plus the one that you specified. So this is actually kind of handy. Let's just, the last thing that I'm going to do is we're going to have a rollover. If I roll over this, I'm going to want to, so I want its default state to be, let's say, top nav item 1 off, and when I roll over it, it's going to be top nav item 1 on. Let's go back to our one here. So first let's just change it. Top nav item 1 off. And make sure that compiles and no errors. Okay. No rollover yet. So let's produce the hover state for this. So we're basically going to take this and add hover. And instead of off, it's going to be on. Okay? So we're doing basically the same thing. If we look at the CSS now, it's included those things as well. It's provided, it's pointing at a different image. The sizes are the same, everything is the same. And now when we go here, if I roll over, we have a rollover state, finally. So that's it. That's Sprites for Compass. And again, look at what it's done. It's produced all of the rules. Everything is absolutely 100% accurate to the original files. Instead of having to load 34 images, we're only loading 1 for this, in addition to the CSS, which we would have been loading anyway in the HTML. And the only code that we had to produce is that. I hope that has you as enthusiastic about using Compass as I was when I first found out about this. And I hope that play around with it, get a sense of what it's like to work with it, and incorporate it into your tool chain. Because it just makes your life easier. it makes things much easier for designers, because all designers have to do now is produce that folder of images and hand them off to a CSS developer, and all the developer has to do is recompile the project and you're done. Again, just think about, go back to the poor person who has to maintain. If this was done manually, someone comes up and says, I want this icon to be an extra 20 pixels bigger in both directions. You'd either have to move this down somewhere else, or you'd have to move everything around it. The CSS designer would have to go into it and change all the rules. It is a major undertaking. And instead, what you'd be able to do as the designer is simply change your mocks, move your slices the way that you would want to export those things. Export the folder again, make sure that the names are good and the names are the way that you want them to be. Hand them off to CSS, and the CSS simply replace the replaced images, recompile, and you're done. So super simple, and I hope that makes sense. And let me know if you have any questions.